a terrific turnout today. Thank you. I'm going to call a bit of a roll so that we have a sense of who's joining us remotely. I'll do that in a moment. But on behalf of Independent Sector, welcome to what we believe is the final sort of information sharing convening of this working group. There is, I would suggest, more work in front of us, and we will talk a little bit about that as we conclude today's session. But as we all know, and some of us around the table are first time in this gathering, we came together about a little more than a year ago after a series of conversations with Jacob and Art Taylor and some others about where the overhead myth campaign was going to go. And what we determined was that there were a whole series of work streams and conversations out in our community around. Not sure about the feedback. So a series of work streams on a very important topic, but all of us sort of touching the elephant in a different place and oftentimes speaking, quite frankly, very different languages about this common problem. And so what we committed to do was to begin convening the various work streams and their leaders and others to build some greater line of sight across those various work streams and, quite frankly, a greater level of trust among their leaders. That's what we've been doing the past year. We made a commitment to do that and then to, at the end of that time, come back together and get a sense of where to now, what have we learned? So we're at that inflection point now with the end of this conversation today. So with that, let me quickly call the roll and then turn it over who actually, okay, Ellen, so I will turn to you to kick us off. Okay, so we have David Thompson and Beth Bowski here from the National Council of Nonprofits. Art Taylor, are you on the line? I believe that he is.
I am on the line.
Hey, Art, how are you? DB Wise, Giving Alliance. Michael Etzel is here from Bridgespan, and Jerry Eckert-Queenan, are you on the line? Perhaps joining shortly. Tom Dante and Robbie Van Rico from Inside NGO are here in the DC office. Jan Masaoka, Cal Nonprofits, you're on the line?
Yes, hi.
Early for all of you out on the West Coast. Thanks for being with us. Linda Baker from Packard. I think she had said she might be joining a bit late. Susan Barrows-Libby, Philanthropy University.
I'm on the line, and I have with me also Kanishka Watanabe, who is our Atlas Fellow, and we're pleased to join you.
Welcome. Southern California grant makers, we've got Chris Essel and Seiran Fu.
Seiran is here.
Correct.
And Dave Sheldon as well.
Welcome, welcome. FHI 360, Wellington Pack and Rasika. Wellington will not be with us. Okay, Rasika, welcome. Kim Schwartz from PSI.
I'm on the phone. Hi.
Great, welcome. Ellen is here. Kate, you're on the line from Northern California Grant Makers.
Yes, good morning.
Good morning. Claire is here. Claire Knowlton from Nonprofit Finance Fund and Sandy McKinley both. Welcome, and we look forward to the presentation. Dan Cardinale from Independent Sector, and then we have several other Independent Sector friends joining us. So Matt Perdoni, Carolyn Mullen, Barry Goodnison. And then we have our technical staff, so Brenna and Sheila, whom you've seen floating, making sure that technically we are alive. Alive and kicking. Jacob Harold, Gabe Cohen, GuideStar. Ellen Wilmot from Komen. Stingy Komen, Ellen, you on the line?
I am here. Hi, Jeff.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Lindsay Austin Louie with Hewlett Foundation.
I'm here. Good morning, everybody.
Good morning. Carolyn Miles, Save the Children.
Yep, I'm here.
Hi, Carolyn. Thanks for being with us. Joyce Ibarra from Weingart.
Hi, yes, I'm here. Good morning / afternoon.
Good morning, Joyce. Ann Wallstaff from Board Source is here in DC. Lynn Cronenberger with SOS Children's Villages.
Here.
At my back, sorry. Vita Jahedi from San Diego Grant Makers.
Hello, I'm here.
Good morning. And Debbie Weir. Are you on the line?
Hi. Yes, Debbie Weir from MAD. Thank you.
Anybody that I've missed?
Yes, hi, this is Sarah Davis from the Hughes Foundation.
Hi, Sarah. Welcome for joining us. Anyone else?
Bernard Unti.
Hi.
Hey, Bernie. Thank you for being with us.
You
Humane
bet.
Society.
Thanks.
Hi, this is Dahlia from Forefront.
Hey, Delia. Thank you. One of our past presenters. Anyone else?
We do have Jerry with us on the line.
Jerry is on the line. Great. Hi, Jerry. Okay, I am going to turn to Ellen to kick us off. We will have presentation and conversation and questions until about quarter of. I'd like to reserve maybe 15 minutes for some other things at the very end of our time.
Okay. Well, thank you all, everybody, for inviting us to join you here. It's a pleasure to be here. And I am grateful that we were able to sort of squeeze in. It turns out to be the tail end of a year-long process. It's great. It's good that we were able to connect in this way. I'm here on behalf of the 3 regional associations of grantmakers in California, NCG, SCG, and SDG, San Diego and Southern California. And as you heard, several of my colleagues are with us on the call, so I'm just here on their behalf in person. Chris Essel, Sayron Fu from Southern California, Vita from San Diego, and Kate Seeley from Northern California Grantmakers as well. So I'm going to go really fast because we have a lot to cover, and so forgive me. I'll try to remember to pause at key inflection points to give you a chance to ask questions. But just early on, in the very beginning part of 2015, the 3 organizations, the 3 regionals launched into this project that we called the Real Cost Project, a joint statewide initiative, and it really was focused on increasing the impact of philanthropy through this mechanism. We worked with social sector partners. Some of you know David Greco, many of you may know him as our our implementation partner. And here are the funders who underwrote the project: California Community Foundation, Hewlett Packard, the Parker Foundation, the Parsons Foundation, and Weingart. This project sought to address 3 key questions, and it really was, it was designed from the outset to be a multi-phase and learning project. It was, and this first phase really was all about understanding the situation, really what are the opportunities and the barriers. And these were the 3 questions that we were trying to address. What are the organizational or institutional barriers to changing grant-making practices? What are the sector-wide barriers to changing grant-making practices? And what types of support or capacity building is needed to help grantmakers adapt their grant-making practices? This is all with respect to what we were calling real cost. And we'll talk about the terminology later. I appreciate, as you all do, that that's a key thing here in this discussion. But for our purposes today, in that portion of the project, we're really talking about funding nonprofits, adequately to sustain them as healthy organizations that deliver the outcomes that we're trying to support. That's fundamentally the working definition that we used. The process that we used was, multi-sector, and it was multifaceted. It was really designed for breadth and to really encourage candor. So it was qualitative. We worked with, first of all, statewide. We were up and down the state. We deliberately engaged funders from sort of a range of types of funding, as you can see there: corporate, family, community, giving networks, public endowments, individuals, with a broad range in terms of their budget size. We involve people at all levels of the organization. We talked to trustees, we talked to CEOs, we talked to program officers. And we did it in a couple of different ways. Most specifically, most importantly, we did regional fora. We had well over 100 agencies and foundations and institutions represented at one or more of these gatherings, where we asked them a series of questions. Typically, you know, there'd be 30 to 40 people in the room in a facilitated conversation. And then as well, once we had that under our belt and had the benefit of some early learnings, we actually invited some key executive leadership and CEOs to host some invitation-only C-level briefings as well, to try to make sense of kind of what their concerns are from their vantage point, and also share with them our early insights into what we were hearing. And there again, we had well over 100 senior leaders join us at some point. They touched this in that process. We learned a lot. And again, with the emphasis on it being qualitative, I will tell you that there certainly were a number of common themes and insights that I think we gained. This is where I put my glasses on because this is the slide where I do most of my talking. But, and again, for those of you who've been steeped in this, I would expect this will be a surprise to you, but I think it's very helpful that we now have this, sort of the benefit of this amount of sort of feedback from all over the place to really underscore what we believe to be true, and that is this. First of all, we know there is a lack of well-defined policies in place to guide real cost evaluation and reimbursements. The number we have here is just short of 60% do not have formal policies in place to guide program decision or grant-making decisions in this space. There's this sort of common unwritten, accepted rate of 10 to 15%. That's typically fairly negotiable and might be highly variable even from program officer to program officer in an institution, not just from institution to institution. That may also vary with the relationship that the grantee has with that institution, how new it is, how seasoned it is, what the mental models are about that nonprofit, and so forth. There is an explicit or implied limitation or a cap on what should be what should or could be an acceptable rate. If you want to talk about indirects in particular, and by the way, I'll refer to indirects. I know that's another area where we have to get clear, but I'll use that word today, and Claire will spend a lot of time talking about that. And that there's a lack of common understanding of terms. So, and I've already been stumbling over myself for 10 minutes, so you understand that that's a real problem right now. Funders rely on individual staff members to make decisions around whether to engage in real cost funding, and those staff rarely have any formal training on how to do that thoughtfully, and what information to seek, and how to know, and how to evaluate the information that they receive. That is institutional, and it's also field-based, we believe, this sort of lack of formal guidance and training. Cultural norms and perceived best practices really drive what's going on here. It's what's always been done, this is what's reasonable, rules of thumb, language like that. This is non-judgmental, by the way, this is just true. I mean, it's really just the way it's being done right now. There certainly can, and we heard that there are negative associations with indirect costs in many cases, and that, the lower the number, the better is in fact that is a view that is held by some. I'll also surface something important in terms of kind of when, for those funders who are now really diving into this inquiry, and as you can see, many of them are supporting us in our work, but there are others. There is concern about sort of going it alone. This is a situation where there's concern about, whether to be first. You don't want to be first or last, and so there's a real desire expressed for field-based support for these conversations that we're having today. So I think that energy, at least in as we experienced it in our community and talking this through, is very much there. There's a desire to get together around this, and that there's an openness to shifting, but there's also an acknowledgement that these are deeply embedded cultural practices. This is not about policy. It's about sort of the air that's breathed in the room, and it's a much, much bigger undertaking than just what number you put on that line of the project budget, right? Very much bigger than that. There's also concerns voiced that the amount of giving will have to increase, and I think that's something that we have to take on squarely to really understand what that means. If you move to a full cost model, kind of, funders are concerned that means that somehow they'll have to double their grant making in order to continue to do what they're doing, and so we have to think about that. And then lastly, just to note that program-based thinking and functioning, the way most foundations are structured as program-based, it institutionalizes these practices to some degree because it really enforces the idea that the programs themselves, not the overall organizational capabilities, are what matter the most with respect to results, outcomes, if you will, and this idea that fundamentally budgets can sometimes be seen as an accountability measure rather than a tool for impact. So again, there's a lot there. And again, I really want to amplify that there was genuine desire for real dialogue, real candor, a recognition of the power dynamics that are in play in a room when funders and nonprofits try to get together on this, that results in constrained authenticity and transparency, which is, of course, foundational to all of this. If these guys can't be talking frankly together, then it just won't change. There's a desire for more data that's reliable and capacity to understand and work with it. And it's a deep desire for common definitions and alignment around terminology and methodology. And in particular, what I'm going to say out loud is, in particular with this group of funders who are supporting our work and the work of many of you who are themselves grappling now with these multiple projects. And so I'm so grateful that we're here kind of in time to be part of the conversation. So here's a little bit more, and I'm going to go really fast. This is some of the ways that we've been thinking about, sort of as we were exiting the project, thinking about what these barriers are and how to maybe begin to think about overcoming them as we move to phase 2 planning. We're looking at the real need for executive buy-in and making sure that the change starts at the top. And that includes trustees as well, who are critical decision makers in the funding world, obviously. That this engagement with grantees is real, authentic, candid, and sort of armed with tools and capacity and information that can inform better decisions, joint sort of understandings of what's needed. That practices are formalized and made clear so that everybody is operating. It doesn't mean everybody does the same thing, by the way, but that there's some shared framing or sandbox, if you will, that we're all in. And that training and capacity are really at key, that we really need to spend time, a lot of time, with the teams that are making this happen on the ground and with their nonprofit partners in order to get where we want to go. So with that, I'm going to hand it over, but wait, I should say, I'm now going to pause for questions on this is the phase 1 work at 1,000,000 miles an hour. I'll talk afterwards about where we're headed next. So if you have questions about that, just hold them until later.
Any questions for Ellen at this point? I'm just going to remind folks here in DC, if you're seated in front of these little microphones, run your finger over it, turn it green, and I will be sure to call to folks online as well for questions. David?
I successfully got the microphone working. Oh, thanks for that. The comment about training is fascinating. Many of us attended a Forefront event, I met Jacob in Chicago in January 2014, talking about this topic. As Jeff said, is one of the early phases of what this work now is. And the discovery was program officers who were attending saying, don't leave us out. We need this training too. So as you're training nonprofits on real costs or indirect costs or government cost allocation systems, bring us in too, because we don't understand what nonprofits are facing. Right. And at the same time, we don't know what the policies are in our organization and everything else you had on your chart there. The program officers were fessing up that they needed this very much. So you're reinforcing a consistent theme. I think you highlighted it very well. 2 things on that brief. One is, yes, that's what we mean. Our project really is funder focused. So there's, Jan has done a lot of work in the nonprofit sector. Nonprofit Finance Fund is involved. That is not the focus of our particular project. We are pretty much exclusively focused on this group, and that's where you're hearing the energy, positive energy, towards wanting to have this kind of capacity building. The second thing goes to that whole issue of candor. The truth is, it's very, because there's sort of by definition an uneven power dynamic. If the program officer isn't going to
be an enthusiastic participant in that conversation, and if not initiate it him or herself, it's going to be hard for the nonprofit to carry that water alone, and it just won't happen because there's too much risk. And so part of what you're doing by sort of creating these shared tools is you're leveling that playing field at a key moment when they're trying to make these key decisions together about how to leverage impact with the dollars.
Any questions online? Robbie, do I see anyone online wants to ask a question at this point? Michael.
Your blind spot.
Yeah.
You had such a diverse set of funders participating.
Yeah.
Were there any bright spots or practices that you found promising out of that group?
There are many. I mean, and I think you probably know them as well as I do. I think our project wasn't designed to survey or make sense of kind of what the current practices are in any systematic way. So I can't actually say to you, you know, this is what we know is in play, other than those high-level numbers, which were mostly just done like this. You know, it really was not a qualitative undertaking. But we are already familiar with funders that are doing multi-year grants, that are doing general operating support, that are launching special funds for, you know, debt retirement or reserve building or capital. I mean, these are all elements of full cost funding that abound. I think, again, I think what we have right now with Weingart, Packard, and Hewlett are funders who are thinking barriers. That's cool.
The impact is amazing. Just echoes out.
Just keep going and going. Anyway, so I think anywhere you see multi-year funding, anywhere you see GOS funding, anywhere you see special funds for things like this. And I think there are regional organizations like mine and others, my counterparts and elsewhere in the country, who are already doing some of these trainings kind of on a one-off basis. They are happening. But what we're looking at is a more systematic, broader, field-based approach.
Great. Dan?
Any coloring around this notion of no one wants to go it alone.
Yeah.
And that there is a desire to have kind of a movement in the field.
Yeah.
So I heard that tension. Was there any kind of sense of, there are clearly, to Michael's point, some best practices out there, so that there's some field leaders. Any brainstorm that came out or any insights around what the kind of catalyzing the field building work? Yeah, that's before us, right?
We're right here.
Right, but so you all, right, so I think this is what we're trying to do.
Yeah.
So the answer to the question is nothing that emerged in the conversation.
Oh, no, but it was really, the word movement was not ours. It came out. It really emerged from the room. People saying, you know, this is the basis of a movement that really needs to happen. This is the only time I'm going to editorialize today. But I want to say this. I think if you didn't have a sense of urgency about the need for flexible funding before November, you should now. And I have a point of view about that I feel strongly about and hope to advance. I mean, we need flexible funding because nonprofits need to be flexible and nimble and responsive. And the only way for that to happen is for that funding to be able to move. So I think we can make a stronger case even as we go. That's me sort of in my editorial hat. I think there is some energy. And I think appropriately funders are as well mindful of their stewardship responsibilities and a whole host of other considerations that they're taking into account. And fly out of the chute, but it seems to me this is a moment.
Yeah, for sure. That's great. Thank you.
And I think that some of the questions in the room are really interesting because the pilot that that we ran actually gets to some of those. So not wanting to go it alone, who's going to be first? Well, thank you, Weingart and California Community Foundation, for saying we're going to be first. Yeah. We're gonna test this out. And to the point of needing to bring the sector together, of not leaving the program officers behind while we're training the nonprofits, or not leaving the nonprofits behind while philanthropy moves forward. You know, our pilot addressed that as well. So if it's all right, I'll go ahead and jump right in. I feel like we had plans from the audience to just move us forward.
We try to do our part.
Thank you. So I'm going to talk about the full cost pilot, the community of practice pilot that Nonprofit Finance Fund Weingart Foundation and the California Community Foundation came together to lead. And I'm going to take us through the goals of that pilot, the design, the structure, the participants. There was an external evaluation, a formal evaluation, and that report is available. And so we'll make it available to you all. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time on the evaluation as well, but not too much. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on the structure because that evaluation covers it all. But I'll spend a good amount of time on our design thinking behind it, and then also introducing you to the actual full cost framework that we use to advance these conversations, really with an eye to surface wisdom from the room. You know, how do you see this framework, and where do you see opportunities for improvement in advancing that framework?
Thanks, Claire. Let me just take a moment. We're hearing somebody who's undoubtedly taking copious notes on their keyboard, so if you can just mute your line. Thanks. Claire.
Great. Oh, I seem to have lost my ability to move forward. Ah, there we go. Thank you. So the intention of the pilot was to really demonstrate how nonprofit leaders and foundation program officers can together develop a shared understanding of full cost and have transparent conversations, honest conversations around full cost funding. So we're really trying to move from identifying the problem, which I think our sector has done a lot of work on, to trying to test out some possible solutions, or at least the first step in some solutions. And as we were designing this pilot, we really saw the issue that we were addressing at the intersection of technical and cultural, similar to what Ellen spoke to. It's necessary that we get the calculation right. You know, the numbers have to be right. But we also have to acknowledge that there are beliefs and attitudes that underpin the practices in our sector that have held us back from addressing this problem in the past. And so one without the other is not going to advance us. We really looked at how do we address both together. For NFF, we sit at this interesting middle space in the sector where we do a lot of really deep work with small and mid-sized nonprofits on figuring out what their costs are, the kinds of nonprofits that really represent the vast majority of domestic-based nonprofits. But we also deploy capital into the sector. We deploy our own capital, and we also deploy capital on behalf of others. So we are interested in making sure that those philanthropic investments are meaningful and get impact. And we don't see those two frameworks as in opposition to each other, but rather both come to inform the way we moved forward. So something that we've learned from being in this space for a few decades, for three and a half decades, is that the most apparent needs are not the only needs. And as a sector, we're often operating with incomplete data. It's just true that most of the nonprofits in our space have had underinvestment. And so if we use only their financial statements as a basis for understanding what their costs are, we're starting with flawed data. We're already starting with costs that are not accurate, that are underrepresented. So we wanted to start by first telling truth to ourselves, as my colleague Sandy likes to say. We needed to be able to empower nonprofit leaders to really know and advocate for what their costs are. And that's actually quite tricky to do, because the sector has been operating with a scarcity mindset for such a long time that some of these costs are just invisible to nonprofit leaders, right? So we think about the costs that are right in front of us, and then we think about those costs that come up in the midst of an emergency, and that's about as far as we can get. So we needed to create a framework that was big enough and complete enough that it could give voice to all of those costs, the very obvious ones and the ones that are that we are less able to see at times. We also wanted to avoid creating any sort of yardsticks that end up becoming compliance measures in the sector. And I will just speak from our own experience. You know, NFF has done a lot of work around reserves and the need for liquidity within organizations. And when we're doing this work, you know, we get asked, well, what's the right number? What's the right number of months of cash that we should have? And we felt pretty good about kind of putting some guideposts out in the marketplace. Well, if you have less than 1 month of cash, you're probably in crisis. And if you have 3 months, then there's some room to breathe. And if you have 6 months, well, now we can think about the future and we're really moving, right? Those, I see nodding. I think you've heard those metrics before. And I have seen in my own experience with clients and with funders that those have been taken up as best practices that we should follow. And so when I start working with a client, oh, what are your goals? What are your da, 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 da? Well, we want to have a 6-month cash reserve. Okay, tell me about that. Why is that? Oh, well, it's the best practice. And it has never been interrogated. Is 6 months enough? Is it too much? Is it reasonable? Is it something we can accomplish, right? But it's just a best practice. And same thing on the funder side, funders that look at balance sheets, calculate that month of cash for a potential grantee, say, oh, 6 months of cash, they're doing real good. Like they're in a good position. Well, I had a client that does all of their fundraising 1 month out of the year. And if they ended their fiscal year with less than 11 months of cash on the balance sheet, they were really going to have to reposition the way they operated the next year to make it to that next fundraising cycle. So if they ended the fiscal year with 6 months on the balance sheet, that would be alarm bells. So we didn't want to create something like that, a yardstick that then organizations get measured against as normal or abnormal or good or bad. We really wanted to instill in the sector the need for good thinking. So that doesn't mean that there are no standards. The framework is universal. The process is something that can be standardized. The calculation is what's local. We also recognize that once organizational leaders understand what their full costs are, there's still a big gap between knowing that as a nonprofit leader and then saying that to a funder. And the reason for that is the gap between the two is often quite big. The gap between the operating budgets that we're used to looking at and a full cost lens are quite far apart. And so we knew that if we were going to foster transparent conversations, we needed a framework that would be understood and useful for both funders and nonprofits, that would acknowledge that this is a sector problem. This is an ecosystem issue. It doesn't sit just with nonprofits. It doesn't sit just with funders, that we can all do better. And that you won't be seen as foolish or a bad manager or a liar if you as a nonprofit come forward with this much bigger number than you've ever talked about before. So the need to hit a little bit of a reset button. So the structure of the pilot, we did a financial trend analysis, a 5-year analysis on the participating organizations, and they all joined 2-day financial knowledge and storytelling clinics, set a baseline of financial knowledge to be able to talk about and advocate for their needs. We had 2 convenings where we brought funders and nonprofits together. We had a full day, full cost workshop where we worked through definitions, we worked through a case study together, we introduced a tool, an Excel-based model for calculating full cost within a nonprofit. And we were quite intentional about the way that that day was structured. Intentional to the point that we actually assigned seats as if it were a wedding. We made sure that every table had a nice mix of nonprofit folks, of foundation folks, that we separated program officers and their grantees to help foster that safe dialogue. And a lot of good and honest conversation came out of that space. The process of learning together as peers and coming into the information together fresh on all sides, and that activity of struggling together through concepts was incredibly powerful, and we saw that throughout the evaluation responses. The half-day convening, which followed about 4 months later, was focused on communications, implementation challenges, and possible solutions. And then throughout, we had technical assistance and coaching, one-on-one with organizations and foundations around better grasping the concepts, calculating full cost within an organization, looking at grant-making practices and thinking about how to better address that. The participants included 12 Los Angeles nonprofits. The things that they had in common are they are Los Angeles nonprofits, and they all opted in to the pilot. It was very much an invitation. Some chose not to participate, right? So we had 12 participants, and they're all grantees of the California Community Foundation and or the Weingart Foundation. But otherwise, in terms of budget size, in terms of age range, in terms of sector, they were all over the map. We even had one that was still under an incubator, you know, very, very young organization. And the two funders that participated had a number of things in common that helped make this pilot successful. So there's support for full cost at leadership levels in a very strong way. They both have a history of making general operating support grants, so they do other grant making as well, but general operating support is really present for them. They have a commitment to partnership with grantees, and in a way where their grant-making practice is informed by what they learn from their grantees. So they're very responsive to the needs of their grantees. And they've also done previous engagements with NFF, done a lot of financial training. Finance is just part of how they analyze their grantees. So the language of nonprofit finance is very comfortable for these funders. So that's the structure of the pilot that we ran, and I'll pause there to see if there are any questions about structure. Again, a lot of this is outlined in the evaluation that we can provide to everyone, but otherwise I'll move on to the framework.
Questions here in DC? Online?
It is. Okay.
Okay.
Thank you. So when we at NFF talk about full cost, this is what we mean by full cost. It's different than other frameworks you may have seen in the sector. So I'm going to take us through it and really asking the room to bring a critical eye and think about what's missing, what works, how could we do better. So for this framework, I invite you to think about each slice of the pie as a seat at the table or a voice in the conversation rather than a percentage of a whole. When we talk about total expenses, we think about what's on the income statement. It includes operating and non-operating expenses, so those things that are normal day-to-day like rent and payroll, and non-operating expenses like we got hit with a lawsuit and we have a big legal bill, something that's rather unusual. It includes depreciation, the ongoing cost of impact measurement, and some upfront costs of impact measurement, like maybe bringing on a consultant to help with that. It includes all the direct program costs and indirect or overhead expenses that you would find on an income statement, all there. It's not any purchase that's capitalized. It's not repayment of debt. It includes one other piece that we don't see on the income statement, which we call unfunded expenses. Unfunded expenses are those that are not currently incurred by the organization in cash, but if they were covered, they would allow the organization to work at its current level in a way that is reasonable and fair. So it's not money to expand or do more. The most common place we see unfunded expenses show up is sweat equity, that overworking and underpaying of staff. So as an example, if we have an executive director who works 60 hours a week every week, if we were to hire a 20-hour-a-week assistant, that executive director would scale back to 40 hours a week.
58 hours a week.
No, and that's the point, right? To 40 hours a week. The organization wouldn't be doing more, but they'd be doing the work that they're currently doing in a way that is fair and reasonable. So the cost of that 20-hour-a-week assistant would be the unfunded expense. The executive director doesn't keep working 60 hours a week, doesn't take a pay cut. Other examples we might think of are subpar supplies, really bad technology, slow internet. This particular concept of unfunded expenses we found really was taken up by the folks in the pilot and others where we've presented this work because it finally gives language to what nonprofits have been trying to say, which is we're working too hard. And everyone says, well, you should be working hard. This is hard work. I don't understand, right? But this actually names what we're talking about is we're working in a way that's unreasonable. That's part of our full cost, right? Doesn't show up on our income statement anywhere. It doesn't show up in our books. Have to talk to management, have to understand the context of an organization to know what these are. Sure.
Because I think the way this is being stated, which makes an enormous amount of sense to me and has great resonance in my own personal experience. So we need to be very clear up front. It also is, to me, where the battleground of this issue can go, because the way it's framed is a value judgment about what would be fair compared to who or what.
Mm-hmm.
And that becomes, I think, then the really kind of black box, as it were, of what adjustment looks like. I just want to, I presume that's why it's been named, but it struck me as from a highly analytic process to all of a sudden a value statement about what is a reasonable work week for an executive director. Right, that becomes a value judgment. So I just want to flag that because I think that may be a really important link to narrative and everything else.
Absolutely. Good. Anything else before we jump on forward? Okay. The remaining slices of the full cost pie are all balance sheet items. So we have left the income statement. These all get funded out of surpluses. Working capital is next. These are dollars to cover the predictable timing of cash ebbs and flows. So they're to keep the organization operating even when the cash coming in and cash going out the door each month doesn't match. And it's needed by every organization. The amount needed is going to vary depending on a particular organization's cash flow, but we can do cash flow projections and cash flow planning to figure out what that right number for an organization is. Working capital should be easily accessible to management. It's in the checking account. It's not board designated. It's not restricted. It's not in an investment account where you can't access it. Management can use this and replenish this day to day, week to week, month to month, simply to pay bills and keep the organization running. It is not dollars to cover lost revenue. It's not for unplanned expenses, not for deficits. This is money for liquidity. And notice that we've made a distinction between working capital and reserves, which in past NFF work we've sort of all kind of put together, but working capital functions differently and on a much shorter time frame. We've called it out as something separate. The reserves are dollars that are used and eventually replaced that have a real intention behind them, a clear intention. And this is what's often board designated. So examples of intentions could be an operating reserve to protect the organization from something going wrong, lost funding, an unexpected expense, maybe a leadership transition. Another example could be a facilities reserve to maintain a building, pay for repairs or eventual replacement of systems. Reserves are needed by all organizations, but the size and purpose is particular to that organization's context and needs. Reserves are accessible to management, but only under certain conditions, right? So the board might have to approve the spending, and they might be held in a separate account, as an account or perhaps an investment account. Debt principal repayment. It may seem obvious that if you borrow money, you will have to pay back that money. But funders don't want to pay for debt, and the paying of debt principal doesn't show up on our income statement. It's a balance sheet item. And so it's an easy thing to forget about if we don't call it out and plan for it. we at NFF, we're funders. So we think debt, or we are lenders as well as funders. We are lenders, and we think debt can be a very valuable financing tool, but there has to be a plan to repay it. And that plan to repay is commonly for year-to-year surpluses, because while a funder may be super interested in giving you a big bulk of money for your capital campaign to buy a building up front, they may be a lot less interested in paying your monthly mortgage. Fixed asset additions, this is for the purchase of new equipment, buildings, land, etc. It's not for the replacement and maintenance of existing fixed assets. So that's something we save for in reserve. We can use depreciation from our total expenses as a proxy for that saving in reserves. The last piece of the pie is change capital. Change capital is a periodic reinvestment into the organization. So it's not every year, might be 5-year, 10-year, 20-year gaps between when an organization needs change capital. And it is to reposition the organization's business model, the way that it makes and spends money in service of its mission. The change capital dollars should cover the upfront cost of change, as well as any deficits on the way to that new business model. The funds should include dollars for the launch or scale of revenue generating activities. The change capital that just covers the expansion of a program, but doesn't cover the people who are going to raise the money to pay for that program long term, that's change capital done wrong. So revenue generating activities are an important part of what's covered in change capital. Typically large, flexible, multi-year funding from an external source, could be a group of funders that come together, could be a capital campaign. What we're not talking about is self-funded or organic growth. I want to acknowledge that some of these are much easier to calculate than others. So I've taken some of our full cost wedges here, I've put them against a continuum from easiest to calculate and most objective on the left, to hardest to calculate and least objective on the right. So debt principal repayment is a pretty easy thing to figure out. I can look at the loan agreement. It's a third-party verifiable set of information, not hard. You go to the other end of the spectrum with change capital, we're talking about doing multi-year projections against a new business model that we haven't tested out yet, predicting when the expenses are gonna hit, how long it's gonna take for the revenue to ramp up. We can certainly do some good planning and get some good intel around that, but let's acknowledge that that is a much less objective and a harder to calculate piece of the full cost pie. Full cost also needs to be applied in context. And so the full cost needs of each organization are particular to that organization and they change over time. So this framework is an invitation to stop and ask, which voices in this conversation do I need to listen to? We can split the pie right down the middle. And the items on the left are those that are needed by some of the time. So not everyone's gonna buy a building, or if you do, you're not gonna buy a building every year. And not every organization needs debt. But if they do need debt, at some point you pay off that debt. Then you don't have to think about debt principal repayment anymore. The slices on the right side, total expenses, working capital, and reserves are needed by all organizations all of the time. It can be overwhelming for a nonprofit to go from thinking about just the total expenses slice, which is where most of the sector's conversation has been happening, to full cost. The number can be quite scary, and we would not suggest that this is something you achieve in a year. Full cost thinking is a journey, it's not a destination. It's a way of thinking and it's many years of planning. Something that can really help nonprofits and funders to think about prioritizing those full cost needs. Say, what's most important? What do I need to address first? What can I think about later? So the prioritization, the hierarchy of needs that we apply is liquidity, adaptability, durability. Liquidity comes first, and that's having adequate cash to pay your bills on time. Adaptability comes second. That's the flexible funds that allow for adjustment, change, or growth over time. Durability is third. That's where we think about an organization existing long into the future, think about buildings there, think about investment reserves or endowments there. I can take the full cost pie slices and I can spread them across a continuum from liquidity, adaptability, and durability, and we can see where different slices of the full cost pie may meet different needs depending on how it's being used. I'm going to quickly say just a little bit about the results from the evaluation and then turn it over to the room for discussion. But the framework that I just introduced you to is what we use throughout the whole process. So we introduced it in the full cost workshop for both funders and nonprofits, and then we worked with that framework and the resources that we built around that framework to determine full cost for organizations and help organizations and funders have conversations about full cost. You can see from one of the exhibits from the evaluation done by Carter and Company here is that the vast majority of nonprofits and funders, participants, left with a better understanding of the full cost of running a nonprofit. They understand how to calculate full cost for an organization, and they feel more comfortable communicating and advocating for a full cost approach. I'm just going to read this quote on the top right that one of the participants left in the evaluation. The humility of both funders and nonprofits going into that room was key. Their willingness to just learn and being willing to admit that both funders and nonprofits can do this better. So with that, I would love to turn it over to the room for thoughts and feedback and responses and areas for improvement. We at NFS are very interested in moving this messaging forward, and since the pilot have tested it in a variety of different places. So we've used the full cost framework with a cohort of federally qualified health centers in California, with a cohort of funders in Maine, with groups of performing arts, national touring performing arts organizations. We've used it in short-term settings, 90-minute session at a conference. We've used it in 2-day clinics with follow-on technical assistance. And overall, it has been very well received. Folks are really able to understand the language and walk away with key ways of thinking for themselves. But I would not suggest that the framework is perfect or done. And we have many ideas about how to improve it in areas where it can get better, but I don't want to give those away. I want to hear from the room how you think this could be better.
Clear. Thank you, Ellen. Thank you. So I'm going to turn to Jacob in a moment. We'll start here in DC and then shift to online. Just ask, as you take the floor and ask your question, just please identify yourself so everybody knows who's speaking. Jacob?
Great. This is Jacob Harold with GuideStar. First, my congratulations. I've been doing this work on this set of questions for more than a decade, and I found that clarifying and helpful for me personally. So thank you. 3 pieces of potential feedback. One is I would junk the pie chart, because if you explicitly said these are not supposed to be equal, and then you had a series of later visualizations but it quickly leads people to a mental model that these are equal. And so I would throw that out, because for visual thinkers like me, that's immediately the way that people begin to absorb the information. Yeah. The second piece is, and it's sort of a question, when I see the facilities expenses, I think of them as a type of reserves or a type of change capital and not their own category. So I'm interested in, why does that need to be separate? So that's a question. And then my final thought is, at the beginning, before you even got to the new framework, you talked about how you had seen people take a guideline and turn it into a best practice, which turned it into an ironclad law. Yeah. And I completely agree that we don't want to do that. Then you also had a great quote, which I liked, which was, the framework can be universal as long as the calculation is localized. And I think that is absolutely essential. And in particular, I've long advocated that what we really need data standards that reveal diversity in the field by having information presented in the same way. But the way you frame it at the beginning, you talk about we need to avoid the lock-in of standards. when you mean lock-in of standards of calculation as opposed to lock-in of data standards. So how do we criticize locking in a calculation while not criticizing data standards? Does that make sense?
I think it does. And I think that part of the answer has to do with the fact that we don't have good data as a sector. And so it could be that we arrive at a place where everyone is using the same calculation, we're all speaking the same language, and we can actually say something about what's normal and not normal, what's appropriate and not appropriate in certain circumstances. I don't think we have that yet.
Yeah.
And I think when we were engaging in thought work around this, we were like, okay, what kind of standards could we put in place? And we started coming up with so many different ones that all intersect and inform one another, that it became, okay, that is no longer useful, right? But I think if we did have better data as a sector, we may be able to get to a place where we can say something meaningful about certain types of organizations.
Yeah, and I hope that we can have a proactive stance that organizing data in a consistent way is a good thing and should be a goal for us.
Yeah.
Even though interpreting that data in the exact same way for every organization is a bad thing. And so I think we can hold those two things, which are actually very consistent, but if we're not clear about the language, I think we'll be confusing to people.
Definitely. To your point about the pie slice, 100% agree. I mean, I think you saw me nodding. I have it like, that's one of the things that we want to next. Haven't come up with anything better yet, but definitely want to. And to your point about fixed assets versus reserves versus change capital, this is another one. I mean, like, you're grabbing onto the flaws that we've identified too. This is great. So to my accountant brain, I have in addition to having been an executive director, I used to be an auditor of nonprofits. So as an accountant, this doesn't bother me. Dual entry accounting is the way the world works. And so of course, things would show up in two places. Every transaction shows up in two places. And that's true for the full cost framework in many ways. So when you're talking about fixed asset additions, could it be something that's funded from change capital? Yes. Could it be something that you saved for in reserve? Yes. Could it be something that you borrowed for? And so it's about debt principal repayment? Yes. So that fluidity between sections is real, and is something we haven't resolved. And again, my accountant brain is like, that's not resolvable. That is the way the world works. But not everyone has an accountant brain.
Sure,
so definitely thank you.
And actually, you're focusing on it as fixed assets because I just sort of heard facilities. But that I think is the distinction that I was missing there. Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Online? Questions? If not, I'm going to jump to Anne, and we'll come back to online.
Waiting for green. There we go. Anne Mollister with WordSource. So just echo what Jacob said. I think this is awesome, and I wasn't familiar with this body of work, so I'm really glad to know about it. Picking up on Dan's comment, I think this concept of unfunded costs is massive. And it may be worth actually thinking about lifting that up to one of the primary categories. Because I think that that's a place where we want to have a lot more conversation, and getting it so that it appears as one of the categories and is on that spectrum, I think would really help with that. Embedded into that, and I think this speaks to some of the work that the National Council has been doing and others have been doing, if there's a way to think about partially funded commitments as part of that unfunded cost, that could be an interesting other pain point to help surface. When you get a grant for something, that means that you have to do it, but it hasn't paid for all of the expenses associated with it.
Can I just jump in with a reminder for those online? Can you please mute? We're getting some background noise.
The host has unmuted us. We can't override that.
Okay, we'll look into that. Anne, please keep going.
Sure. If If that did get lifted up to a primary category, it might be interesting to look at that hierarchy of needs and add a first one that's essentially saying baseline. So that before you're getting into kind of being ahead of the game, you're acknowledging that we are behind the 8 ball now, and the first step is getting to baseline.
Fabulous. That's fabulous.
Okay, so Robbie from Inside NGO. I mean, to echo this unfunded, I want to get some insight because that seems like the most, like a very big challenging piece. I mean, we work with international NGOs and you tend to want to throw everything in the kitchen sink in there. You know what I mean? So what is unfunded programs change? Just because something isn't funded doesn't necessarily mean it's unfunded. I mean, if we're not going to do face-to-face training and move online learning, so how do you work with organizations to say, this is a really an unfunded cost, or is it not a really challenging thing to come up with what are your unfunded expenses? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
You know, we tend, I mean, my experience has been, you know, you work with countries or programs, they tend to be like, this is all unfunded because it was not paid for, right? But that doesn't necessarily mean it's unfunded. We change our strategies, become more efficient, and we kind of look at doing, you know, things more creatively. So, you know, as we work with country directors, things would say, this is really an unfunded cost. This is. So I don't know if you had the same experience or if that came out in working with these organizations or if it was actually fairly easy to do.
The experience was that it was actually fairly easy to do. Okay. I think for most nonprofit leaders, they're aware of the difference between sort of their aspirations and the current operating reality. They're also aware of the things that they are able to cut and eliminate when they don't have funding for them, and the things that have to happen no matter what. And those things that have to happen no matter what, whether because it's, you know, compliance stuff or because it's like really mission critical stuff, you can
keeping the lights on.
Yeah, keeping the lights on. You can tell it's an unfunded expense by the way it is carried within the organization. It is the burning out and the wearing down and the demoralizing of staff. It's the computer that has to be shared across multiple people because only one computer will send email. You know, it's like the things that fell into unfunded expenses when we were doing the calculations with organizations were just like immediate and known. But that's really interesting feedback, and I think it's something worth considering as we move forward with other organizations that they may not have that same experience. And so providing better clarity around what an unfunded expense is or isn't could be a really useful area for us to work. Thanks for that.
Can I just ask before I turn to you, anybody online before I turn to Beth Bowski? Okay, Beth.
Thanks. Beth Bowski with the National Council of Nonprofits. I just kind of want to follow along with that because one of the things that we certainly see with government grants and contracts is, and that the whole issue of the overhead myth is that nonprofits tend to do without in order to keep, the first thing they cut are going to be those things that would be considered administrative or indirect costs. And so they do without. And I think the culture is such that they're so used to doing without, it's hard for them to even identify what would really help them if they could pay for it. So I'm wondering, you know, you said it's fairly easy, but is it culturally, is it really that easy to get at all of the unfunded costs that really exist?
Yeah, I mean, it really starts with a surfacing with the organizations. And for some organizations, it's easier than others. Those who have really struggled for a long time and have just gotten used to totally unreasonable working conditions and expectations, it can be a lot harder to surface those things. But the introduction to the concept immediately starts, sort of the light bulbs come on and people start churning, and it gives permission to think about what we might really need. And sometimes there are, some follow-up conversations that need to happen, right? 2 or 3 or 4 follow-up conversations. But sometimes they're just really simple questions, who's doing your bookkeeping? Oh yeah, well, we couldn't, it's a real story. Well, no one's been doing our bookkeeping. We actually haven't had any bookkeeping for the last 6 months because we couldn't pay our last bookkeeper and we owe them $5,000. And oh, okay, so you need a bookkeeper, right? Sometimes you just start asking about what are the functions, how are your computers working, how are your programs operating, how are your staff feeling? And those things start to reveal themselves pretty quickly.
Other questions? Yep, Rasika?
So this is Rasika with FHI 360. And so I want to ask a question that is beyond bookkeeping, okay? So when you took the sample of firms to check, did any of those firms have audited financial statements?
They all, I believe all of them. There might be one. So the one who had, was under a fiscal sponsor still, the fiscal sponsor was audited, they had delineated balance sheets and income statements as a supplementary set of materials. I'm trying to think if anyone was not audited in the pilot. I think they all were. There might have been one exception. When we've taken it to other places, so the work with national touring arts organizations was quite a mix. So many that only had internals, as well as a few that had audits. I think for the FQHCs, they're all audited. So yeah.
What's behind your question? The reason I'm asking that question, okay, so in 2018, accounting changes are coming to non-profit firms.
Yeah.
One, of course, is a lot about reporting on cash. So whether we like it or not, starting in 2018 on the financial statement itself, we'll have to put a lot of color on the amount of cash the firm has, how they want to manage the cash. So the benchmarking will automatically happen there. There are funders will be able to evaluate, looking at the financial statements, the cash situation. You'll be forced to do that.
Well, the change is a statement in the notes about the organization's liquidity position and how they manage their cash. So it is up to the nonprofits to tell their auditors, don't just say, we managed to 90 days of cash, and if we're under that, we're worried, and if we're not, just don't use boilerplate language. The organization can say, our cash flow is such that we do all of our fundraising during the holy month of Ramadan, and if we do not end the fiscal year with, we do not have, adequate liquidity, right? They could say all of those things. And I think they can also make a clear delineation between what's the cash that's for liquidity and what's the cash for reserve. So I think if we can be smart about how we use that new requirement, we can use it to our advantage as a sector.
Absolutely.
And actually highlight the differences that that organizations have based on their context, and learn more about the different ways that organizations manage their cash position.
And my last comment, of course, is maybe we should engage AICPA and the audit firm community to get them involved in this process.
Yeah, we have my colleague Alice Antonelli, who's our director in Philadelphia. She sits on the nonprofit committee for FABC.
Yeah.
And she and I have been perfect. Yeah. I think that's great. Absolutely, we should. Absolutely.
Oh, nothing. I'm just.
You want to be sensitive to time.
Sensitive to time.
Yeah, and Seiran, we want Seiran to make some comments as well, as I had understood.
Seiran has a few minutes. He'd like to talk a little bit about a specific project that Southern California's been working on that's overhead focused for the government.
I want to make sure that we don't overlook that. So, Barry, did you? No, in my blind spot was again.
I think it's personal.
Michael from Richmond. I really appreciate today's rich conversation about the uses of funds and sort of the many gaps that exist on both the income statement and the balance sheet. And I'm curious out of this pilot how this translated then to the sources of funds conversation. And hearing that idea of this being a journey, knowing that it takes time to get to this position of full cost, how did you see these grantees, actually not with the two funders at the table, because I love the two funders at the table, they're very virtuous and forward-looking in the way they support this set of organizations, but with the rest of their funders, change practice, change pricing, find ways to start recovering some of either the unfunded expenses or the other balance sheet items? What were some of the baby steps that they started to take with maybe not the two of the most progressive funders who could be supporting them?
Thank you. That's such a great question. And so the baby steps that folks took were presenting their budgets differently, having conversations with foundations. So one foundation in particular who's just known for being exceptionally rigid in what they fund. They fund capital, they fund fixed assets, and that's sort of it. And so following this full cost training, one of the grantees, went to that funder and said, hey, so we are applying for these new computers, this database system, yada, yada, yada. And we need to make sure that we properly maintain it and utilize it. And so we need a year of training available for our staff on security measures, for bug fixes on the database, for blah, 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 blah. Can we build that in? And the funder said yes. And, they shared this as one of their successes, and the whole room was like, oh my God, that funder said yes, like what? So that's a bright spot. Not all conversations went that way. Some funders are more interested than others. Yeah. And, something that we've seen happen in other places when a nonprofit had been working with a nonprofit finance fund and really thinking about change capital and wanting change capital, went to a funder, talked to them about change capital, will you do this? And the funder was like, no. What? No. Maybe 6 months later, that funder called the nonprofit back and said, I have had 2 other people ask me if I will do a change capital grant. Is this the new thing? You're the first person that asked me about this. I want to talk to you more about what this is. So there's certainly, I think when we can get a critical mass around these kinds of concepts, we can really make some nice shifts.
Before we turn to Seiran, I just want to take a pause. We've got 28 folks on the line. I've got to imagine that somewhere among them there is a question, and I don't want to be missing you. So let's just take a moment. Anybody on the line that's got questions? Okay, well, you're continuing to formulate your questions, no doubt.
Oh, that's right, Kenny, on you.
Right, I believe that they continue to be unmuted as a group. So there is the opportunity to jump in, but maybe we can turn to Seiran and let Seiran make a few comments, and then we can circle back.
Yeah, we can bring the jack back up then. Seiran, you're on, man.
Great. Good afternoon to everybody in Washington, D.C., and good morning to those here on the West Coast. I have promised brevity, and so in that promise, I don't think I have control of my slides on my end, so I will just ask for next slide when appropriate. Can we go back to the overview? Great. So for many of you, this might be an introduction to the work that Southern California grant makers in partnership with stakeholders, including Cal Nonprofits and Weingart Foundation, have been doing. And for some of you, this is an update. And to balance those perspectives, we're going to speak briefly a bit about the scope of work, why we're focusing on state and counties, in particular Los Angeles County, how we're attempting to achieve compliance, some of the lessons learned, and then questions thereafter. Next slide, please. So we titled this conversation, having government real talk about real cost, and to take the conversations learned so far into our state and local governments here in California. And so why are we doing that? And this is a product really of the Office of Management and Budget, which published new rules to simplify and improve relationships with government and nonprofit organizations. And the uniform guidance, in its intent to improve and clarify allowable practices for the reimbursement of indirect costs, sets forth 4 permissible methods to do so for nonprofits. And these include the use of current federally negotiated indirect cost rates, the use of a de minimis indirect cost rate of 10%, a negotiation of indirect cost rates with a pass-through entity, and then a direct charging of certain administrative and shared costs through allocation methods already permitted by the uniform guidance. And we focus, and the scope of work is centered around the County of Los Angeles, the California State Association of Counties, which is the association of 58 counties in California, and the state of California. And this work is funded by the Weingart Foundation, the California Community Foundation, James Irvine Foundation, Annenberg Foundation, and PIMCO. Next slide, please. So why are we focusing on state and counties in the first place? Why are we talking about federal rules and federal dollars at the state and county level? The first is we follow the money. States and counties serve as the primary conduits for pass-through federal dollars locally. And in the chart you see here from the California Budget and Policy Center, in California, that represents more than 1/3 of the state budget. So federal funds account for about 36% of the state budget. And then secondly, it's this concept of we the people, where federal dollars that impact nonprofits come predominantly to health and human services departments at the state and local level. And so that's why there's an education effort at the state and county level that Southern California grant makers in partnership with Cal Nonprofits and Weingart Foundation is taking this effort. So next slide, please. So why Los Angeles County in particular? What were the conditions that allowed us to begin this work on informing and educating our government partners about these federal rules? The first goes back to this money concept, where federal dollars make up about 15% of the county's revenue, about $4.5 billion. The second was the political environment. On the County Board of Supervisors, out of 5 members, there was strong interest in 2 of the supervisors of the board, to the extent where the supervisors had staff as a part of these stakeholder meetings of having these conversations about implementing OMB's uniform guidance at the county level. And the third was the sector support. In Southern California, we have foundations and nonprofit leaders who have been actively engaged in this conversation at all spectrums and moving this forward. And Los Angeles County recently did a survey of their nonprofit contract partners, and it was found that of these nonprofits disclosed that 20% of their operating budgets come from contracts with county. So 20% of their operating budget is dependent on these contracts with county dollars, with public dollars. So it's incredibly important that we bring this conversation and this question of implementation to county level governments and also statewide. Next slide, please. So one of the questions we asked is, how do you solve a problem like OMB? And so there were 3 options that we considered. One was the status quo, which is, well, we can await the federal government to review state and local agencies about their compliance with OMB. The second was achieving compliance among state and counties through legislation. And the third was perhaps a soft touch approach, balancing educating and informing and then bringing in other partners with authority. And I think it's clear from the first option that awaiting a review would take quite a while and would not be conducive to facilitating this discussion of compliance. The second legislation, which others have pursued, the legislative process by its nature doesn't allow for adjustment after the fact. That is, once you write something into law, if there are things that come up, you have to come back to the legislature to make those changes. So it doesn't provide an opportunity to test and learn and to take shared lessons to better inform outcomes in the process. The third option that we went with was a soft touch approach, which is to bring our partners at the California State Association of Counties to the table and ask them, what is the best way to educate the counties about these federal rules, and how do we achieve these compliance? And to bring in our state partners specifically with the State Controller's Office. Local governments in California must annually file financial reports with the state auditor. So having the state auditor share this information to encourage and to have county understand these requirements were an important part of educating and changing these practices so that the OMB uniform guidance could be implemented here. Next slide, please. So as we go through this process of working with governments to implement this answering the question of implementation, these are some of the 3 challenges and lessons we've learned thus far. The first continues to be a question of what are we talking about? What is the OMB in the first place, or uniform guidance in the first place? And so many counties remain uninformed and unclear about these requirements and how to implement these rules. The second in our conversation includes this notion of blended funds. So many counties in California combine federal, state, and local dollars in one pot of funding for particular service. And while the uniform guidance applies to these federal dollars, it does not necessarily apply to state and local dollars in that pot as well. And so there's a potential in some of these conversations and concerns we've heard from our government partners is that you could potentially have 3 different indirect cost rates, the federal one, a state one, and a local one. And so how do we have this conversation of developing uniformity and simplicity for nonprofits and for a government implementing the OMB uniform guidance? And then finally is this notion of what about the other federal rules? Many of our county partners have raised this issue where certain grants do have restrictions outside of that. And there's not a catalog, if you will, of grants where OMB would take precedence over some of the other restrictions out there. So that's something that we're facing as well. Next slide, please. So with that, with the promise of brevity, I open it up to questions and turn it back to you in Washington, D.C.
Thank you, Seiran. For those who have been with us through the duration, you'll remember that the first convening that we had, better part of a year ago, was on this very topic, OMB uniform guidance, and a presentation from our colleagues at the National Council of Nonprofits. So I suspect that they may have some thoughts or some questions, reactions that they want to share. But again, let me turn first to folks on the line. Okay. Questions here? Reactions, Beth?
Seiran, we should talk again because I think I can help you answer a lot of those questions. Most of that is really kind of already addressed in the uniform guidance. It's just sometimes plowing through it to find it. I think it also is a good example of why there's problems in implementing the uniform guidance, because here's one interpretation, and there are multiple other interpretations. Let's just take what the government has to pay in terms of indirect costs in the 4 situations he gave. It's partially correct. It's not entirely correct. The 10% is only available if you've never had a federally approved rate, and the state and locals don't have to negotiate, although OMB says this is not supposed to be a standard rate. That last item, I think I know where that's coming from, where some things, I forget how he phrased it, something about making them direct cost if I guess he didn't. I guess they weren't at that. Something about you can make them charge them as direct cost if the agency allows you, or something to that effect. I think what that is not one of the options. But you can do that if you decide to use a certain allocation method. Some of those costs are, in fact, go from being indirect to being direct, but that's separate from then doing your indirect cost rate. Now, if you get a lot of your costs direct charged as a direct cost, means your indirect cost rate's probably going to come down. It's a matter of balancing, but it's not a rate that you would deal with. But I don't mean to call them out, because this kind of thing is happening all over the place, and there's just issues of interpretation. There's the language issues are enormous. And we just even talk about full cost. You talk about full cost one way. People that are talking about government grants, when they say full cost, they mean something totally different. And it's not even really full cost. You know, I mean, you know, an indirect cost when you're talking about the grants is different from indirect costs that you're talking about, you know, so, you know, it does get very complicated.
Go ahead.
Oh, so sorry. And just to clarify, thank you for that clarification. Beth, for the clarification for those on the call, the 4 items I mentioned is a part of an implementation framework with Los Angeles County. And so in crafting something that pulls into the different feedback we've heard from our county partners. So it does combine different elements and is not strictly, as Beth pointed out, reflective of the uniform guidance. It's an iterative process of working with our government partners to find a framework to have these conversations. And it's not something that necessarily is currently implemented already. It's certainly a work in progress. So it is a framework for these discussions to occur. And it is a framework informed by stakeholders, including Cal nonprofits, Southern California grant makers, Vanguard Foundation, and our county partners in developing that framework. So that's something to keep in mind for those on the call and for those listening in as well.
Thanks, Aaron. David?
David Thompson, National Council of Nonprofits. I'm sure Beth joins me in first saying, congratulations, thanks for engaging. We get the opportunity to working with Cal Nonprofits and the honor of working with them and bragging about their work when we have national calls to inspire. And the work in Los Angeles, the focus on Los Angeles, the largest county in the country. It's a county-based state, so if you can fix it there, you can fix it anywhere. We use that phrase to antagonize the New York philanthropy, New York, to engage. And you're working at the county level. New York's philanthropy, New York is working on getting the state and the city to take up the uniform guidance. Why this matters is, remember, Theron said there are many different levels. The OMB uniform guidance only applies to the federal dollars. Well, Philanthropy New York is demanding, pounding the table and everything, saying you've got to apply these rules to city money as well. You've got to apply these rules to state money as well. So they're using that challenge that you're experiencing in Los Angeles as a way to browbeat the politicians in New York City and New York State, which is the joy to behold. You know, but then another alternative, and I don't see Delia Coleman now, only because I'm sure she's wide awake and paying attention. In Illinois, they actually got legislation because it works in Illinois, of legislation that says the federal rules apply to the state rules, so that it's across the board. And they're doing training, and they're doing joint negotiations of indirect cost rates, so that there's not a quibbling over which rate applies. So that what you're doing in Los Angeles is field testing some ideas and making some good progress there, and collaborating or cooperating with Cal Nonprofits and the good insights from their members and folks. And as you all know, Jan Matzoka is brilliant on this stuff. So you have a great asset in California. So this is an example of making progress. Yes, it fits and starts. In New York, they're making progress. Even in Kentucky and North Carolina, they're making, no offense to my accent, but they're making progress in various areas because the uniform guidance has been out long enough. It is the cost principles, we've been talking mainly about finance principles here today. It's cost principles, which is 2 lines on Claire's chart that the uniform guidance focuses on, but I want to requote Theron of saying, follow the money. The reason we've been putting all our eggs in the basket or pursuing uniform guidance is that governments or nonprofits across the board receive 32.5% of their resources from governments. Thereon, I won't say that we're dependent on government. I say governments are dependent on us. They're hiring us to do that work. So semantic that we find important. And as we try to fix, granted, it doesn't take care of, it's getting closer to the unfunded cost. Maybe the capital and all the other, the left-hand side of Claire's pie chart can be dealt with eventually. But in terms of survivability, the survival, the cycle and so forth, we see that as the place to get the definitions fixed. And as we move forward, I'll stop talking in just a second. The government definitions are all over the map. We can discuss, and with foundations and nonprofits deciding the right definition is X, it's irrelevant. 32% of our resources comes from government, and they're going to use their own definition. And Beth could do a couple of hours on that topic. And we had petitioned OMB to try to fix some of these things. Unfortunately, the election came along and they stopped generating paper. But as we get to the definitions issue, please understand, or please recognize that we have to have government engaged. And as brilliant as we all are, their infinite wisdom is going to override anything we come up with.
Ellen? Yeah, well, I think just a few things to add, and then I think we're going to need to round it out. But thank you. First of all, thank you for kind of ending up in the place of kind of talking about this problem with terminology. I think, you know, here it is happening in the room. And foundationally, I think of interest to all of us to try to get someplace. And I think we have, you know, I appreciate and really agree that there's the OMB will do what it does, and you know, it doesn't really matter what we decide as far as they're concerned, but it really does matter what we decide as far as we're concerned and how we want to practice together. So I do hope that would not foreclose our ability to kind of continue to try to converge. And I think there's work to be done, and I don't think we can even go further other than to just name that today. I did want to share, though, where we're going very, very briefly. Phase 2. So we have secured funding to proceed, and we're very excited about this. Just a couple things I'll call up that are changes from the slide that looks almost the same as the last one, but it's really not. First, Philanthropy California. You may know that the California Regionals recently has announced a formal alliance, a strategic alliance, to work together much more deeply in some key areas. This is going to be a cornerstone project for us. And we have also made the decision to move forward with the Nonprofit Finance Fund as our next, as our partner in this next phase, and really have been persuaded, especially by virtue of the experience they had with the pilot project, that we want to move in the direction of full cost as our languaging. So as I mentioned earlier, real costs will go away, and we'll be calling this the Philanthropy California Full Cost Project again. Again, with, I just need to call out the funders who are once again showing up big and somewhat, you know, there's still very few of them. The hope here is that this pool will grow, the number of supporters for this conversation, this inquiry, and this capacity building will continue to increase. But we're delighted with the support that we've secured. The outcomes that we're seeking in this next phase are really focused on this capacity building, training, getting program officers conversant in how to have these conversations with their nonprofit partners, getting nonprofits to the table with similar capacity. Our project will not focus on training the nonprofits per se, but there are other efforts underway in parallel that I think we need to talk about, but we're focused on the funder side in this effort. Ultimately, we have an explicit agenda, which is to increase the number of California-based funders that are investing in full cost funding in some fashion. And we are deeply committed through this project to advancing every effort we can to further align definitions and strategies and frameworks, if you will, as we move forward. We feel that that's actually core to this work. The way we're going to go about this is through a series of trainings and conversations of foundation CEOs and trustees, program officers and staff, nonprofit grantees and funders. Again, with the thing I'd amplify in terms of one of the things about our project that matters, this culture and technical thing, if I could go back to that intersection, we're very interested in the cultural side of this as well as the technical side, helping to sort of figure out how to create and really what it looks like to create good conditions for this kind of discussion to happen, ultimately normatively. That's our long-term goal, but at least for now, to get those conversations started when funding decisions are being made. We're looking at as well the sector level discussions, working with our existing partners. We're partnering already with GEO in California, working with organizations like theirs to bring these conversations to a national stage. Continuing to work with you, we hope to keep this conversation going at this level. I love how that this is, it's a multi-sector thing. I think that's really critical. And I think, so that was it. The Forum for Regional Associations of Grantmakers is another vehicle which is really important. Many of you may be familiar with it. This is the association of organizations like mine. There are 33 of us nationwide, and that is a very strong platform for us to really start to socialize this more broadly, and there's a lot of interest. We hope to be able to, that national conference is happening in July. I'm on their board, and the program is being put together now, and we hope to be able to present some more there and get this rolling in other places. So you can look forward to hearing more from us. This will take us all the way through 2017 and into the early part of 2018. But, and along the way, we're delighted to come back and keep you apprised of our progress and consult with you as well, seek guidance as needed and so forth. That's it.
We have Jan, I think, Jan Masaoka has a question.
Hi, this is Jan from California Association of Nonprofits, and I just, you know, we have been to literally hundreds of meetings with county officials and with bringing together nonprofit CFOs, and a couple of things I think that Ron and Ellen did a great job of summing it up, but when summing it up, it just makes it sound cleaner and easier and more straightforward than it is. And I think one of the things I've really seen is that I think a lot of people, including philanthropy in the nonprofit community, tend to think of advocacy when they think of legislation. And kind of working with regulatory and administrators, that's something that people don't have as much experience in. But I just want to say that it's just been a lot messier and a more winding back and forth way, and running into dead ends. It's just been more complicated than initiatives that kind of programmatic initiatives can roll out in a much more planned way. So I appreciate the flexibility that we've all had working on this.
Thank you, Jan. Other questions or comments from those online? You're around the table in DC. Jacob?
Do you have a sense of scale for the objectives? Like how many foundations do you hope to reach?
Yeah, I think the way we've got it set forth right now is, and we're having a big meeting next week to talk more about the specifics, and we're happy to share all that. But what we're looking at right now in just the overarching frame is probably, we think of ourselves in terms of regions. So Northern California, Southern California, San Diego, and between us we reach well over 600 member organizations. We're thinking about doing 2 trainings in each area, sort of in the coming year. One of them like a half-day workshop that's more introductory, one of them a deeper dive sort of training type thing that might involve pairs of, you know, we haven't quite figured out the specifics. That would be if we can get that done this year. And I think those would be largely open and free effectively. So, you know, you would hope to get 30 to 40 in the room. So by the end of that time frame, I think we'll have, I would expect, because we've already seeded the conversation in our community, we'll get a lot of people back who are very interested in seeing where we want to take this. Thereafter, I think, is the question, sort of. And the other piece I want to offer that we want to explore, it's not so much core to this project, but of course there are many times when an institution might want us to come in and just work with them. In some of the larger ones, for example, it's more efficient for them actually to have us come in and do something just with them. So that's sort of off to the side, and I think it will be also happening as we go.
If I could,
was that responsive?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Mind if I add a nuance to the structures of the training? You know, one of the things that came out of the phase 1 work that Ellen did was the need to bring trustees along in understanding and funding for full cost, you know, that maybe the program officers get it, but they don't know how to make that change at the top.
Yeah.
So that will be part of the trainings that we make available, is specifically geared toward trustees. And then from the pilot that we did with Weingarten California Community Foundation, you know, that learning of the necessity of bringing together funders and grantees in the same room together for a peer learning experience around this, and how essential that is to moving the sector forward. That will be the model that we carry forward for those deeper dive workshops. So while, you know, Ellen's focused on her membership and bringing them along, having grantees and nonprofits in the room as well is part of how we move it forward.
Dan?
I'm wondering, you and I had breakfast this morning and talked a little bit about policy. So are we at a place yet where there is an emerging policy agenda for this work, or are we in the kind of developmental phase of really trying to build some momentum of key funders and grantees to kind of test out what we're doing?
I think it's the latter. Yeah, right now. I believe, though, when we started hearing the word movement come out of the mouths of really influential people, that was encouraging.
Yeah.
But I think that's not right for now. I mean, I think we still have some ground to cover. Yep.
Any final questions or thoughts? Ellen, Claire, Saron, thank you.
Thank you all very much.
So I want to be cognizant of time, and we are supposed to go till 3. Can we take just a couple of moments? I am going to shift us to some process consideration, if I might. I want to remind us, after now a year, what our goals were as we set out in this course of conversations. I've actually lost count. I was trying to think through as we were sitting here. I believe that this is the 6th conversation that we have had. Again, the goals, right? Build greater understanding and kind of line of sight across these various initiatives, all of which are doing great work against a very complicated series of problems, systemic problems, with lots of different languages being spoken, right? So the notion was bring leadership together, begin to build some visibility across those work streams, and some trust, quite frankly, and then step back after that period of learning and begin to think about where do we go from here. So as I said at the top, we're finding ourselves at that point of inflection now. And so we are going to give some consideration to where we go from here. And the recommendation that I have for you is that we'd like to come back, we, independent sector and a group of us around the table, I hope, or a subset of us around the table, come back with a couple of thoughts as to how we might move this piece of work forward from here. We've spent a lot of time over the months talking about the importance of language. Michael, I was thinking, as Beth was making her comment in response to Saron's presentation, you know, this conversation about the importance even of just a glossary. If we could get to a glossary of terms, what kind of value would that bring to the conversation? Clearly, I think more than a glossary is needed, but we'd like to take maybe a month or so and come forward with a construct to bring back to the group, and then look to reconvene the whole of this community, maybe late February, March timeframe, to examine what those opportunities might look like as we go forward and what our roles are. So that's one thing, and I see heads nodding around the table as sort of a process. The other thing that I want to do in the last 5 minutes, and again, forgive me, probably the most effective way to do this is with a survey that you all fill out online after these conversations, and I'm sorry, I don't have a survey to share with you. But I actually would like to take a moment, again, reflecting back against the goals that we set out with a year ago, and thinking through the conversations, realizing that some of you have been here for all of those conversations, some for just a few, some for just one. But if you think about those goals and you think about the distance we've traveled, what have we done well and where could we improve? And the reason that we're asking this is we now, putting my independent sector hat on, always try and understand how we could frankly be doing a better job to meet the needs of the sector. And so this is an opportunity for us to learn. So any reflections that you are willing to share here and now, what's worked, what could we have done better? If not here and now, I invite you to share those thoughts online with through email with us. And next time around, we'll put out a survey. I promise. So just kind of a moment to reflect. Thoughts? Has the journey been worth it?
So this is Jacob Harold with Guide. I'd say yes, absolutely. I think it's been incredibly useful to hear these perspectives in a systematic way, to hear some of them multiple times, and to kind of really begin to see some of the patterns. And I think IS has done a great job of creating a very neutral platform. You guys have not been demanding a certain approach. I think the challenge is that we may be getting to a point where we need that. And I think the document that you're talking about will kind of, to a certain extent, decide how successful this will be going forward, no pressure. And that, you know, now is an opportunity to begin to say, can we draw a little landscape, which is maybe just like a little sketch of the different players. I mean, Inside NGO in a way has started that by putting up the logos, but can we actually map that to actual strategies and constituencies? And as you said, you're going to offer a set of, I hope they are not insights, I hope they are suggestions, I guess. I think we're now at a point where, in my opinion, IS has earned the right to make some strategic hypotheses for the rest of the group, which we'll then, of course, push back on. But thank you for creating the neutral forum that's gotten us to this place.
Thank you, Jacob. Others?
Run with that one.
Well, yeah, no, we're happy to run with that one. But this is right. How do we get better?
This is Tom Dente from Inside NGO. I do not want to fill out a survey, so I'll try to answer this now. But no, I think to echo Jacob, I think the diversity of voices and the quality of the discussion, I think, you know, what's been really terrific all the way through, having had an opportunity to attend most of these, is that the degree of this discussion, we've been to a lot of these across our sector, all of us have. And I think just the quality of the discussion, the insights that are coming out of this and the diversity of points of view are very helpful. But I would echo what Jacob said, is that it feels like, and I think Jeff, you said it too, we're at a bit of an inflection point to say, if we stop here, what's the platform to put forward a narrative, some common language, some common terminology that allows us to do this on a regular basis. So I think there's some nice opportunities here, but just want to thank independent sector for just the great work and both preparing for these sessions, having the diverse voices there, and just making this a very easy mechanism for us all to participate and be part of this dialogue. So kudos to you and your team.
You know, in the spirit of alignment and collaboration, what I would say is, given where we're at in the stage planning with our efforts, there's a lot of room for us to take into account emerging consensus. And I think this is very timely for us to think about, just as we plan this, how we can support and contribute to the alignment that we're all committed to.
Thanks, Ellen. Others, what could have been done better, more effectively? Surely we didn't do everything right, so I'm going to give you some time to think on that. And please, I am asking with all seriousness that that's important for us to hear, and that's how we grow, right? So I'm going to Dan. Right.
I was just going to say that while folks are thinking about this, would this be an okay time to give just a heads up about something that's coming? That might be of interest.
Absolutely, and then turn to Dan.
Sure. So this is not reflection on the group. This is my first meeting. It's been very informative, so thanks for the opportunity to be here. But just related to these issues, I want to give folks a heads up about something that WordSource has been working on that is in some ways connected to this overhead conversation, along with GuideStar, BBB Wise Giving, and AFT. And that is a piece that we're going to be pushing out or making public on Tuesday that attempts to have a replacement framework for measuring fundraising effectiveness. So instead of just talking about cost of fundraising, talking about 3 measures that give a more nuanced and we think more holistic view of fundraising effectiveness. So I'll send some information about that, but I just wanted to give folks a heads up because I think it's obviously connected to this conversation.
We've asked Anne to write a blog, which we will get up on our site, on the IS site, about that as you release next week, right? Thank you. Dan.
So I'm going to, in the spirit of real cost, so I want to thank Jacob and Tom for the gratitude to IS. I've come in late. The question I'm asking is this the most strategic use of IS's time and resources? Can we actually make a material difference here that couldn't be done if we weren't doing that? That's a serious question, right? Because there's a big ocean out there and we got to figure out which pieces, not trying to boil the whole thing. So the question, I guess, to the group is, in your minds, as you think about our contribution to being part of an ecosystem, all trying to drive impact, is this the best use, do you think, of our time and resources and brand attention and membership attention? It's a serious question, right? So I'm getting head nod, but really that, and if you want to think about it, if there are other things in this related field, or is there some other organization that can contribute in a differentiated way? At this point, this is so important, right? Let's get the right people doing the right thing. So just really put that out as a serious challenge, because I'm hearing, yes, please move forward, but we have to make choices. And I think we enter the conversation disposed to do that, provided that there's a real mandate.
Speaking as an IS member, back in her editorial hat, what I said earlier, this nexus that we're at around having nimble, strong nonprofits that are well-funded and funded right. You know, if you want to be able to turn on a dime, that dime has to be able to turn. You're at the exact right spot for this conversation. But I totally appreciate the competing priorities that you're going to have to confront in light of all of the other things we're dealing with. So I hear you, that it may not ultimately be the highest and best use of your time, but it's certainly a great use of your time.
Thank you.
I would identify one particular factor that would lead me to yes, which actually is your dialogue with Darren Walker on the GuideStar webinar, which is the different perspectives of the responsibility of funders and the responsibility of nonprofits and NGOs to solve this issue.
That's right.
And that, to me, is the first thing I think of when I think of IS in terms of that meeting ground, as opposed to the ownership and leadership exclusively by the philanthropic community or exclusively by the nonprofit NGO community. That has been, I think, a critical bridge. And I've been really glad in the last handful of these conversations to have a few more funders with us at the table as well, to be part of that dialogue. I think Tom used that word a few minutes ago, which really has been a big, important evolution for me as a participant. So that's the one really hard to replicate piece of having IS bring us all together.
Thank you, Michael. Anybody else?
Yeah, I would just add, this is Art.
Hey, Art.
Hi, great presentation, everyone. I've been listening very attentively. And Dan, to your question, I actually agree with everyone that this is a perfect issue from my mind for IS to be engaged with, because I can't think of many issues that touch so many organizations in the sector, and donors as well as foundations and government. When you think about it, the whole ecosystem is grappling with this. And I think it's a great place for IS to inject its energy and talent and skill to help us all think through this and come out with the right answer. So I hope that you'll take that into account in your decision making and in your planning.
Thank you, Art.
Thank you all. We're at 3 o'clock. We will be back to you with more about the path forward. And please do take us seriously the opportunity to share follow-on thoughts by email. Thank you. Have a great weekend. Thanks for joining.
Thanks, everyone.